In the dimness of the torpedo compartment, the air smelled of old sweat, burnt oil, and stale bread. They hadn't seen the sun for weeks. The bunks were pressed up against the steel tubes that housed the weapons that would decide life or death. When the signal sounded, everyone moved without speaking. The valves turned, the hiss of compressed air echoed like a gunshot in a cavern, and the torpedo shot out into the blackness. Outside, no one knew they were there. Inside, each one felt the vibration in their chests, as if the submarine itself were breathing. Everything trembled, even the soul, one of them would say years later. Then the charges arrived. 1, 2, 5. The hull creaked like dry wood. One prayed, another vomited, no one screamed. In the absolute silence of the depths, there was only waiting, and death lurking. They were young, most under 25, yet they carried a fearsome reputation. British propaganda called them Grey Wolves. Their own saw themselves as the elite of a new naval Germany. Of the 40,000 sailors who served in the U-boat flotillas, 30,000 would never again reach the surface alive, a mortality rate unmatched by any other German service in World War II. Yet those who survived share one memory. We enlisted because it was the toughest unit of all. If you came out alive, you were one of the best, one veteran confessed at the end of his life, his voice still choked with a mixture of pride and horror. The development of that brotherhood began against the grain of the treaties. Far from the German shipyards, in discreet offices in The Hague and in Finnish sheds, engineers financed by the Reichsmarine designed hulls, engines and torpedo tubes under the commercial guise of the firm IVS, Ingenieurskantor voor Scheepsbouw. In 1933, with Hitler newly come to power, Minister von Blomberg ordered that all this semi-clandestine knowledge be crystallized in a formal school in Kiel-Württemberg. There, 80 applicants and 8 officers formed Crew 33, the first of the annual crews that, like university graduations, would spun their own internal mystique. The training was brutal. Simulators mounted on old minesweepers mimicked rudders and periscopes. They sailed day and night in the Baltic, with orders to fire exercise torpedoes at any moving target. A veteran of the torpedo bay, Matrosenobergerfreiter Hans Joe Eckert, recalled his arrival at the shipyard. It was all an adventure, 6 weeks of basic training, then half a year of radio school, and suddenly you were screwing in every valve on the 616 before you were 20. This painstaking learning process, knowing how to recognize a hydraulic wrench in total darkness, shaped an almost blind trust between command and crew. The training was brutal. Simulators mounted on old minesweepers mimicked rudders and periscopes. They sailed day and night in the Baltic, with orders to fire practice torpedoes at any moving target. A veteran of the torpedo bay, Matrosenobergerfreiter Hans Joe Eckert, recalled his arrival at the shipyard. It was all an adventure. 6 weeks of basic training, then half a year of radio school, and suddenly you were screwing in every valve on the 616 before you were 20. That painstaking training, knowing how to recognize a hydraulic wrench in total darkness, shaped an almost blind trust between command and crew. A modest Type 2 submarine sailed with 25 men, an ocean-going Type 9 with 56. The organizational chart was divided into 2 branches, Seamen and Technica. Above, the commander, at least Oberleutnant zur See, 2 watch officers and the chief engineer. Below, radio operators, torpedo men, helmsmen and diesel and electric stokers. Every man, from the captain to the lowest cabin boy, knew that his sleeping space could disappear from one day to the next if more torpedoes arrived or fresh supplies were loaded. Donitz encouraged any gesture that boosted morale. Thus was born the custom of painting emblems on the turret, a snorting bull, a laughing sawfish, a devil with pistols. Only 14 ships carried the swastika. Most preferred mascots or crests of the godmother city. Symbols leaped from the badge to the uniform, handcrafted badges on caps and knitted sweaters on board. A mongrel dog, Schnurzel, inspired the first drawing. He ended up sunk with a German destroyer bombed by mistake, but his silhouette remained on dozens of hoods and tin cups. Camaraderie was reinforced with simple rituals. The first sinking ceremony, the rum tea service after confirming a distant explosion, the collective signing of the logbook before arriving in port, or the nicknames that replaced rank. A young lieutenant recalled, "The commander could be the Lion, but in the tower we were all simply cheerleaders for the same club." If he missed a shot, we went down together. If we got it right, we celebrated together. The promotions perpetuated this slang. Crew 38 saluted each other with a three-finger gesture. Crew 40 always sang the same refrain as they advanced across the deck to the stern tubes. They weren't enlightened Nazis, but children of the crisis. Children of Hamburg workers, Bavarian printers' apprentices, Ruhr peasants. Lured by the promise of technical training, radiotelegraphy, diesel mechanics, naval electricity, which in peacetime would be equivalent to a profitable trade, they signed up for 2 years and ended up locked in iron coffins submerged to depths of up to 300 meters. The Navy offered me 2 years of training. The Luftwaffe, 4.5, too long for a 19-year-old, summarized Georg Hogel, who would go from typographer to Enigma operator in just a few months. Upon returning from patrol, the elite enjoyed privileges unheard of in wartime Germany. On the French Atlantic coast, sailors were sent to requisitioned chateaux, renamed U-Bootwiesen, where wine, improvised tennis, and medical attention restored color to faces yellowed by lack of sun. At Travares, you could forget about depth charges for a week. You could even take your girlfriend, remarked a U-441 engineer, still proud of the grounds and the crew. The trade-off was iron discipline when the Einsatzbefehl sounded. Within 72 hours, the same man was playing hockey in Angers and checking valves 30 meters beneath the Bay of Biscay. On the surface, we smoked like chimneys. A single radar blip was enough and everything would fall silent. The fear came when the enemy propellers could be heard through the hull. Each blow was like a hammer against your stomach, recounted a hydrophone operator after his third mission. Another, a torpedo operator, admitted, "The worst part wasn't firing, but reloading amid the muffled screams of the bolts and the smell of grease. You knew that every minute on maneuvers was a minute without being able to dive." Both phrases encapsulate the paradox. The elite lived between the excitement of the stalking and the statistical certainty of disaster. The beginning of the war. The sky was grey over the North Sea when the first prize fell. It was September 3, 1939, and the captain of the U-30, Fritz Julius Lemp, believed he was attacking an armed transport. In reality, it was a passenger ship, the Athenia. When the torpedo exploded against its side, not only the German submarine campaign began, but also a war of perceptions, propaganda, and brutality. The image of the submariner as a shadowy killer was cemented by that first mistake, and it would not stop there. Combat at the start of the war was marked by one advantage: surprise. Convoys were not yet the norm, escort systems were improvised, and many Allied ships sailed unprotected along familiar routes. For U-boat commanders, it was a time of opportunity. With only a few operational units, Dönitz could not launch a massive offensive, but each U-boat set out with the expectation of causing as much damage as possible. The tactics were simple and effective: surface navigation at night, periscope search during the day, and sudden torpedo attacks from close range. In the first months, the submariners went out on patrol without knowing if they would return. Many of them were facing their first combat mission. For many of the crew, this was not just naval warfare, but their debut in a real war. Excitement mixed with fear and absolute concentration. In the control room, each whir of the hydrophone was followed by total silence. Propellers were listened to. Vibrations were analyzed, and when the target was identified, everything became a rapid and precise choreography, calculating the course, loading the tube, adjusting the gyroscope, opening the hatches, waiting. The torpedoes often missed. There were premature explosions, non-detonating impacts, and trajectory deviations. The magnetic mechanisms were still far from reliable, and several commanders reported that after firing a salvo of 3 or 4 shells, none had reached the target. This generated frustration, especially when risking position for nothing. Some officers, like Otto Kretschmer, began firing from minimal distances to ensure impact. He would later summarize it in a brutal phrase: "You have to see the hatch covers before firing." At this stage, U-boats still navigated primarily on the surface. Their diving speed was slow and their battery life was limited. This meant that in practice they spent most of their time facing out into the world under grey or blue skies, moving quickly with their diesel engines. The lookouts took turns in the turret, the officers drank hot coffee in the chart room, and the sailors in the torpedo compartment slept among potatoes, hanging hams, and oiled steel cylinders. When smoke was spotted on the horizon, the routine changed. They had to get close, check for enemy presence, plot the interception route. Sometimes the ship was sunk simply with a well-aimed torpedo. Other times the crew was taken out in lifeboats and the deck gun opened fire. That image, that of the submariner offering blankets and cigars to British shipwrecked sailors, coexisted with a more somber one when witnesses could no longer be allowed to be left behind. The first battles were not limited to the Atlantic. The North Sea, the Norwegian coast, the English Channel, all these areas saw early patrols. Some enemy ships were armed and several German U-boats fell victim to their own greed. One of them was U-39. It attempted to torpedo a British aircraft carrier, but the shells missed. The ship responded with depth charges, forcing the submarine to surface. The crew was captured. It was the first casualty of the force. The setback did not deter the others. Dönitz urged them to maintain the pace, to attack without respite. The fighting was intense but brief. A successful attack lasted seconds. The wait for the torpedo to reach the target, the explosion, the shout from the lookouts if there was fire or if the enemy ship began to list. Sometimes the men went up on deck and watched with binoculars. "It's splitting in half," someone muttered. At other times the target resisted, responded with fire, or tried to ram the submarine. These moments were the most dangerous. If one was on the surface, it was a matter of seconds to turn the wheel and dive, but if the enemy managed to fire, they could destroy the turret or pierce the hull. U-31 was attacked while reloading torpedoes on the surface. There were casualties. From then on, commanders demanded greater vigilance during maneuvers. The initial successes boosted morale. Patrols returned with several ships sunk and without a single casualty. Returning to port was a ceremony. Marching bands, families, decorations. The names of the commanders began to circulate in the corridors of high command. Kretschmer, Prien, Schulze. Each developed their own style. Prien attacked at night and preferred a quick dive after firing. Kretschmer approached on the surface, fired at point-blank range, and elegantly retreated. Schulze devoted himself to reading Shakespeare between attacks. The mystique of the submariner began to grow. They were no longer just sailors, but protagonists of a silent war. But that same mystique masked tensions. The crews lived in confinement without showers, with 4-hour shifts. The air became denser. Carbon dioxide levels increased. Skin diseases were common. Arguments over space or food were not uncommon. The fear of depth charges was ever present. It wasn't an immediate fear, but a slow, heavy one. They knew that if the enemy detected their position, the dance of explosions would begin, and there was no defense. They could only descend, stay put, and hope they didn't hit. The hull creaked like a wet branch, one operator would recount years later. The convoys. The order came through the shortwave receiver, coded with a series of letters and numbers that the radio operator wrote down with a firm hand. The commander leaned over the navigation table, read the message in a low voice, and everyone knew immediately that a long night was approaching. Contact with convoy in quadrant BD 2389. Friendly units approaching from the east. Maintain shadow. Await signal for attack. It was the most feared and most anticipated warning. In the submarine's compartments, the men began to prepare. Tubes were checked. Torpedoes were secured on loading rails, periscope sights were cleaned. Each attack on a convoy was a gamble, a dance of steel and darkness between enemies who often couldn't see each other, but hunted each other by instinct and hearing. The first step was to approach unseen. Cruising on the surface, their hulls barely cutting through the blackness of the Atlantic, the lookouts in the tower scanned the horizon. Some used binoculars, others preferred to look with their naked eyes. "You saw a black line, like a chain of shadows floating," recalled an officer on watch. As they approached, they began to make out the profiles. The large cargo ships lumbering along the waterline, the oil tankers with their gleaming hulls, the escorts zigzagging along the flanks like dogs guarding a flock. The commander gave the order to dive when they were about 5 or 6 kilometers away. Then the world shut down. Inside the submarine, only the red lights of central control and the subdued hum of the electric motors remained. They dived to about 20 meters, deep enough to approach silently. A hydrophonist pressed his earphones into place and with a tense face reported the convoy's position. "I counted 18 different propellers. They moved like clockwork in time. You knew you were in the middle of something big. The periscope was raised in short bursts. A target was chosen. Course and speed were analyzed. The calculation had to be exact: distance, angle, torpedo depth. There was no room for error, and then simply the trigger was pulled. "Launch tube 1, 3, 4, fire!" The torpedoes popped out with a sharp thud, propelled by compressed air, then the thickest silence imaginable. 10 seconds, 15, 20, long enough for every muscle in the body to tense, and then an explosion, sometimes one, sometimes two or three in succession. The blow of success shook the hull and produced a shudder of immediate satisfaction. It was a mixture of relief and fear. You knew you had succeeded, but also that now they knew where you were. Because the next step was the reaction. The destroyers soon broke away from the formation. They spun around at maximum speed and began dropping depth charges in circular patterns. Inside the submarine, the world became a sounding board. The explosions echoed like underwater hammer blows. Your teeth ached from the trembling, your ears bled, and yet you waited for the next one. The crew stopped talking. Only the terse reports remained. Charge aft, depth 40, opposite direction. The commander made quick decisions. Turn, drop deeper, slow engines. Some covered their ears. Others clutched the wooden cross hanging over their bunks. No one slept. If they managed to evade the hunt, the second part of the attack began. Sometimes they regrouped with other submarines arriving from different quadrants. The famous pack attacks were organized, wave after wave during the night. While one distracted the convoy, another flanked on the opposite side. Once the escorts were identified, attention focused on the larger vessels, troop carriers, full tankers, and refrigerated vessels. We fired at the sides first. That way, the ships in the center were caught in flames and erratic maneuvers. Occasionally, if the night was clear and the sea was calm, the U-boats would resurface and use their deck guns. They fired at the waterline, targeting already damaged areas. Some merchant ships responded with improvised artillery, but they rarely offered effective resistance. The cannon wasn't just a weapon, it was also a symbol. The gunners climbed aboard, hands shaking from the cold and fear, aimed, fired, and lowered. The commander assessed whether it was safe to continue. If an aircraft appeared, they dived immediately. Attacks on convoys were a mixture of calculation and chance. Sometimes the very sea that helped conceal the ship became a trap. Fog ruined visibility. A mistake in the hydrophonicist's reading could lead to an empty ship being fired upon or the perfect angle being missed. Other times chance played in their favor. A torpedo hit the right spot, an internal explosion multiplied the damage, and the convoy was completely disorganized. Then the submarine slipped through the gaps like a hunter among wounded animals. Testimonies agree that the nights of attack were the most intense, but also those that forged the group's spirit. The quietest crew member could become a hero by activating a valve at just the right moment. The commander could earn ultimate respect if he managed to escape a hunt without a scratch. Upon returning, the survivors remembered every second in detail. In the port, when greeted by other officers, they recounted the names of the sunken ships as if they were trophies, but rarely spoke of their moments under fire. Some attacks left silent aftermaths. One cook recalled seeing the bodies of Allied sailors floating on the surface among barrels of butter and crates of fruit. Another said that after an impact, he heard the screams of a burning ship through the hydrophonist for several minutes before the hull split. The order was always the same: no rescuers. The patrol continued. The objective was to sink tons, not take prisoners. That order, carried out without question, left an awkward silence when it was all over. The first happy times. The fall of France in June 1940 changed submarine warfare in ways no German commander dared imagine a few months earlier. Until then, U-boats departed from bases in Germany, skirted dangerously around the British Isles, crossed the North Sea or the Strait of Iceland, and lost days on grueling routes before reaching their patrol areas. But with the occupation of the French Atlantic coast, the entire Atlantic opened up like a new book. Bordeaux, Lorient, Brest, La Pallice, and Saint-Nazaire became wolf's nests, naval fortresses from which U-boats could launch themselves directly into the heart of enemy shipping. It was then that what the sailors themselves would call, without irony, die glückliche Zeit, the happy time, began. Distances were shortened, patrol frequency increased, tanks carried more fuel than they needed, and torpedo bays were filled with extra ammunition. A torpedo man on U-99, Heinrich Klaas, recalled that the first time they sailed from Lorient, the difference was felt in his body. We didn't have to cross the Shetlands. There was no hunting before the hunting. From the moment we left port, we were already in a war zone. Within 48 hours, we saw our first merchant ship. It was as if the entire Atlantic was tilting toward us. In those first months of French bases, U-boats seemed to be everywhere. Convoys were still inconsistent, air defenses were minimal, and the escort system had not been perfected. It was a time of almost daily sinkings, clean hits, and unpunished escapes. Carl Friedrich Merton, commander of the U-68, wrote in his diary, "We sank 7 ships in 11 days. The nights were long and dark, and the sea was as calm as a lake. We fired 2 torpedoes and waited with the periscope fixed as if in a duel. Sometimes it wasn't even necessary to dive." For the young crew members, many of whom had never been in combat, the happy days offered a mirage of glory. The U-37's cook recounted how his commander, Werner Hartmann, allowed them to open a jar of fruit every time a sinking was confirmed. "We ate peaches in syrup while the radio announced that another enemy ship had sunk. Sometimes it felt like a party." Even the most reserved submariners acknowledged that it was a period of tactical euphoria. They sank, disappeared, reappeared. The ocean had become a permanent hunt. "We sailed among hot coals," said a lookout on U-48. "Each burning ship illuminated the next prey." The morale of the crew members grew stronger with each return. The bases in France were undergoing rapid expansion. The TOT engineers were building concrete bunkers to protect the U-boats from future bombing. On land, the sailors were welcomed as heroes. The bars in the streets of La Rochelle and Brest were packed, and officers received invitations to dinners, dances, and hotels that had previously been reserved for English tourists. "It seemed as if the war had been left at sea," wrote a U-65 petty officer. "On land, we were living like normal men again, and that's why we were willing to return again and again." The contrast was so strong that many considered it a kind of spell. Out at sea, death and persecution. In the port, wine, rest, and women. But the real center of their happy times was the sea. There, the U-boats operated like masters of the game. A lieutenant on U-123 described how they would surface and approach a poorly escorted convoy and fire from 1,500 meters with complete impunity. "It was as if they didn't see us. Sometimes we would fire twice, change position, and fire again before they even looked for us." During these patrols, the crewmen began to develop habits of trust. The commander might allow longer sleep shifts. There was time to shave, and even hot stews were cooked if the weather permitted. "We weren't afraid," said a sonar operator on U-96. "We knew the enemy couldn't touch us, not yet." The radio broadcast daily successes: tons sunk, ships destroyed, routes cut short. Donitz spoke directly to the commanders upon their return, took time to review patrol logs, and awarded them Iron Crosses, special leave, or rapid promotions. The men felt they were at the center of the German war effort, that they were indispensable. A helmsman on U-93 wrote in a letter, "We feel like knights of the sea. We do what others cannot. The enemy has big ships, but we have the ocean." The sea, however, did not forgive arrogance. On some returns, the U-boats arrived damaged. Others never returned. Propaganda avoided mentioning them, but the men knew. Sometimes a bunk remained empty. Sometimes an unanswered letter confirmed everything. In the midst of happy times, death was a presence that did not bother, but was noticeable. A crew member of the U-46 said that during card games, if someone mentioned a sunken ship by mistake, silence immediately fell. "We didn't talk about them. We didn't say their names. We concentrated on what was next." Even so, the general feeling was one of control, of victory. The number of ships sunk exceeded all expectations. The routes to England were fraught with danger. Allied radio stations constantly warned of German U-boats, but they couldn't locate them. One German commander summed up that period with a phrase he repeated to his officers: "No one can hunt us yet. We're the ones hunting." That confidence, that atmosphere of almost absolute dominance could only last for so long. But while it did, the submariners experienced it as a unique moment, somewhere between war and myth. They sank undetected, drifted away like shadows, and returned to the port with flowers in their hands. "We were young and believed it would last forever," wrote one chief engineer. "But the sea doesn't give second chances." That happy time was brief, but it left indelible marks on the men who experienced it. Because for a few months in an immense ocean, they were masters of the night. The first aces. In the early months of the war, when U-boats still operated from German ports and each patrol was a risky voyage to the Atlantic routes, commanders who managed to sink 40,000 tons were considered aces. That figure was a symbolic threshold. Not everyone reached it. By mid-1940, only a handful of commanders had surpassed that number, and their names were beginning to circulate in the offices of the BDU, official Kriegsmarine reports and radio programs informing the public. Being an ace meant having tasted blood, having returned with results, and having demonstrated that the art of submarine warfare was more than a technical exercise. It was decisiveness, calculation, endurance. It was killing without being seen. One of the first was Günther Prien, commander of the U-47. Not only had he managed to sneak into the British base at Scapa Flow and sink the battleship Royal Oak, but on his subsequent patrols he racked up tons with fearsome regularity. He was charismatic, disciplined, and his crew followed him fervently. By the time he crossed the 40,000-ton mark, his name was already famous even among civilians. Postcards bearing his portrait were printed, and songs were written in his honor. He died in combat in 1941, and with him one of the earliest legends faded. Otto Kretschmer, commanding U-99, achieved this milestone meticulously. He preferred to attack on the surface at night and fired from close range to guarantee every hit. His reputation was forged not by the number of ships sunk, but by the efficiency with which he did so. Every torpedo counted. He crossed 40,000 tons in a single patrol and continued to add to the tally until he became the commander with the highest tonnage sunk of the entire war. Unlike Prien, Kretschmer survived. He was captured and spent the rest of the conflict as a prisoner, but his name, Silent Otto, continued to be used as an example of absolute professionalism. Joachim Schepke, for his part, was extroverted, smiling, with a magnetic presence that contrasted with the sobriety of his colleagues. He was frequently seen in magazines, hugging sailors, saluting from the turret of the U-100. He was a skilled night hunter. His career was as brilliant as it was brief. He was sunk in March 1941. He was only 28 years old. By the end of 1940, with the occupation of France and the opening of Atlantic bases, submarine warfare entered its most expansive phase. From Lorient, Brest, La Pallice, and Saint-Nazaire, U-boats departed for the center of the ocean without having to cross the guarded straits of the North Sea. The Atlantic was open, the enemy was ill-prepared, and convoys were still slow, scattered, and poorly escorted. It was then that the figure that had previously made a commander an ace began to seem modest. 40,000 tons was no longer enough. To earn that title in the happy times, as they would later be called, one had to sink 100,000 tons or more. The new standard was achieved by a select few, forming a kind of elite within the elite. Eric Topp, commanding U-552, became one of the most famous. With the Red Devil painted on the turret, his submarine was recognizable even among allies. Topp sank more than 35 ships and exceeded 150,000 tons. He was respected by his crew and colleagues. He had an instinctive way of reading the convoy's movements and was known for remaining calm under fire. Heinrich Lieber, commander of the U-38, also achieved this feat. He was reserved, not given to exhibitionism, but consistently effective. He reached 100,000 tons without seeking notoriety. He was barely mentioned in official reports, but among the BDU officers he was considered an example of tenacity and tactical ability. Heinz Wilhelm Eck, Victor Schütze, Reinhard Sören. The list of aces grew rapidly in 1941. In just a few months, the Atlantic seemed to have been taken over by the wolves. Radio broadcasts announced weekly tonnage accumulations, the names of returning commanders, and decorations awarded. The German public followed submarine warfare as if it were a league table. Articles were written about the captains, testimonies from their sailors were reproduced, and their tactics were analyzed. There were also brief mentions of lesser-known commanders, but who stood out for some particular characteristic. One of them was Heinz Scheringer, commander of the U-26, who surpassed 40,000 tons in the Atlantic during the summer of 1940. His name appeared in a brief radio bulletin for having reached this milestone, and it was noted that he was born in Argentina. a curious fact that caught the attention of German listeners. It was the first time a commander of South American origin was mentioned as part of the Oceanic Offensive. The rise of these aces cemented an ideal commander, young, technically impeccable, silent but determined, capable of leading under pressure with a sense of duty and risk. Many were barely 30 years old, some not yet 27. They were part of a generation of officers molded in the austerity of the post-war period, trained in secret, convinced that the ocean was their natural territory. To their crews, they were almost paternal figures. To propaganda, they were symbols of success and dominance. However, that status wasn't eternal. As the war progressed, convoys were reinforced, the enemy learned, and the seas began to become more hostile. Many aces were sunk on their second or third patrols. Some disappeared without a trace. Others were captured and spent the rest of the conflict in prisoner-of-war camps. But during the years 1940 and 1941, their shadow was cast across the entire Atlantic. And as long as the tonnage continued to increase and the towers returned laden with marks and victories, the radio would continue to repeat their names. Because in that silent war, it wasn't enough to return. They had to sink, and the more, the better. The fighting outside the Atlantic. The North Atlantic was the main route, the heart of the Allied effort, but it wasn't the only ocean that saw the grey and oily trail of U-boats. As the war progressed, the Kriegsmarine decided to extend its reach, sending its wolves beyond conventional routes, beyond British radar, to places that until then seemed immune to the submarine scourge. The world became a hunting ground. Africa, the Caribbean, the coasts of the United States, the Gulf of Guinea, even Oceania. Each voyage was longer, lonelier, more demanding, but also more surprising, more profitable, and more brutal. The accounts of those who participated in these missions describe a different kind of war. Heat was the primary enemy, not the destroyers. Aboard the U-506, which operated off the coast of West Africa in 1942, one sailor noted, "Sweat dripped from the bulkheads. The cabins were like ovens. We slept on the steel plates with our trousers wet from our own bodies." The tropical humidity rusted tools and spoiled preserves. Illnesses, which were rare in the Atlantic, began to appear, skin infections, fever, vomiting, and yet the hunt continued. The Gulf of Guinea, so far removed from the main battlegrounds, was the scene of multiple attacks. British and Dutch merchant ships were intercepted near Lagos, off Monrovia and Freetown. From temporary bases in Lorient and Bordeaux, Type 9 submarines departed with 3 months' worth of supplies and orders to remain hidden. One of the commanders noted in his diary, "We saw a ship for the first time after 17 days of complete silence. It seemed like a dream, but the attack was perfect. No reply, sunk in 4 minutes." In the Caribbean, the results were even more spectacular. The so-called Operation Paukenschlag drumbeat began in January 1942 with U-123, U-66, U-130, among others, reaching the shores of the United States undetected. It was a tactical outrage. The headlights remained lit, the ships sailed with lights, the radios broadcast music. It was like hunting in a park. We could see the Atlantic City casinos from the surface. You could hear the music in the wind. And right in front, an oil tanker. We sank it with 2 torpedoes. No one pursued us, wrote an officer on watch from U-66. During that campaign, U-boats operated within sight of the coasts of Florida, North Carolina, and even New York. Commander Reinhard Hardigan of U-123 was one of the first to attack directly off American cities. "I saw the lights of Broadway from the periscope. It was crazy, a theater set. And we, the executioners, were right there," he would say years later. The routes to Venezuela and the Caribbean Sea became particularly lucrative for oil trafficking. U-boats like U-156 and U-161 sank port facilities and ships off Curaçao, Aruba, and Trinidad. On one occasion, while attacking a freighter off La Guaira, a sailor on U-502 observed, "The coast was so close you could see the houses. When the ship exploded, the flames lit up part of the port. We screamed like animals. It was the hunter's euphoria." That same U-502 was destroyed shortly thereafter. Revenge was swift, but it didn't halt operations. In South Africa, the coast off Cape Town and Durban became a new field of operations for the Ijsberg Group's U-boats. Patrols were solitary, lasting up to 4 months. One commander wrote, "I've never seen such solitude." For 30 days we found nothing, and then a convoy. We attacked it at night. We sank 2 and escaped unseen. When they returned, the men looked like ghosts, gaunt, silent, but content. Further east, some U-boats even operated in the Indian Ocean near Madagascar and Ceylon. U-862, under the command of Heinrich Timm, reached Australia, attacking off Sydney and then sailing to New Zealand. It was the longest mission undertaken by a German U-boat. The ocean was an endless mirror. We took turns watching from the turret, hopeless, and suddenly awake. The boat was small, but she was alone. We destroyed her with the deck gun. We didn't even waste any torpedoes, recalled one of the gunners. Voyages to these distant regions required not only tactical skill, but also a distinct physical and mental stamina. Morale was severely strained, and the isolation was absolute. Sometimes there was no radio contact for weeks. On the U-196, operating off Java, one sailor suffered a nervous breakdown. He stared at the bulkhead for hours. He muttered his mother's name. We had to tie him to his bunk, recounted a non-commissioned officer. However, those men also felt something special about operating so far out, a mix of adventure, responsibility, and primal fear. It wasn't just about sinking ships, it was about showing that the ocean was ours, that there was no corner of the world where the wolf couldn't reach, said an operator on the U-161, who survived 3 patrols in the Caribbean before being sunk. Voyages to South America, Oceania, and Africa were less frequent than those to the North Atlantic, but their impact was profound. They demonstrated that the reach of the U-boats was not symbolic, but real, that no coast was safe. And although the toll was enormous, the testimonies of those who returned with salt-stained beards and uniforms sticking to their bodies speak of one certainty. The world, for a time, belonged to them, at least beneath the surface. The hunters began to be hunted. Starting in 1943, the ocean ceased to be a refuge. What had once been a stealthy and almost unpunished hunt became a floating trap, a blue hell with no way out. Submariners began to die at a terrifying rate, not from convoy artillery, but from the sky. Submarine warfare became a desperate struggle against an invisible enemy that fell like lightning and struck without warning. It was the year airplanes took over the Atlantic. The introduction of airborne radar, the Lee Light and Ultra, which revealed coded positions, changed the very nature of submarine warfare. Refueling areas, routes to America, and stretches near the African coast became floating graves. Each night, as the U-boats surfaced to recharge their batteries, they were exposed. The sky became our enemy. You could no longer just look at the horizon. You had to look up. And pray, sailor Wilhelm Rolfs, a survivor of the U-338, would later say. Testimonies from those years describe short patrols, limited contact with convoys, and brutal clashes with patrol squadrons. U-664, commanded by Adolf Graef, was spotted by an American aircraft while cruising on the surface. We saw it late, just seconds, a black shadow and then the roar. It fell right on top, a radio operator recounted. The submarine was destroyed. Only 7 men survived. In the Bay of Biscay, where the U-boats were to cross upon leaving the French bases, the situation became untenable. U-438, commanded by Heinrich Heinzen, was located by a B-24 Liberator just 150 kilometers from the coast. We didn't even have time to dive. The first hit was on the turret, the second hit the sail. We screamed, but it was fire and water, wrote a sailor rescued by a French fishing boat. Heinzen and all his officers were killed. The RAF's 120 Group and U.S. Navy squadrons based in Iceland, Morocco, and Trinidad patrolled tirelessly. The Sunderlands, Catalinas, Wellingtons, and Liberators were equipped with radar and flares and could even detect periscopes. On air patrols, the pilots coolly reported contact, impact, destruction. But for the men inside a U-boat, it was a death sentence. Commander Werner Henke of the U-515 recounted one of these attacks. We surfaced after 16 hours submerged. The air was thick. Barely 10 minutes later, the cry, "Plane, starboard." Diving was impossible, so we fought. Gunfire, explosions, smoke. We sank the plane, but another arrived later. They followed us for 3 hours. We sank with 3 bombs in our hulls. The pressure was unbearable. Henke survived. He was captured and died in 1944 while trying to escape. By mid-1943, the missions had become suicidal. The so-called Gulf Hunt, the sorties from Lorient, Brest, and La Pallice, ended with several fewer U-boats per week. U-622 was destroyed by an RAF Halifax on July 24. U-197 was annihilated by 2 South African Catalinas off Madagascar. U-459, a replenishment mothership, was attacked by a Wellington while refueling 2 other U-boats. "It was like attacking a hospital. We had no artillery to repel that. Everything was blown up," recalled a U-459 petty officer who was thrown overboard by the explosion. Commanders who were hailed as heroes in 1940 were dismissed with resignation in 1943. Dönitz knew this. That year, more than 250 U-boats were destroyed. Some lasted less than a week on patrol. The U-200, under the command of Heinrich Schonder, was sunk on its maiden voyage by a British aircraft on June 24th. There were no survivors. Hans-Joachim Ramlow of U-402 received a coded message from the BDU reporting the sinking of 5 colleagues that same week. He responded with a laconic note, "The heavens have betrayed us. We are no longer hunters, but prey." A few days later, his own submarine was attacked by an Avenger from the aircraft carrier USS Escort. The aerial torpedo destroyed the bow. They all died. Many accounts were never written down, but intercepted radio recordings reveal final moments. One of the most harrowing was that of the U-604, damaged by 2 consecutive air attacks in the South Atlantic. Unable to continue sailing, Commander Horst Holtring ordered an evacuation. His last radio message was, "Ship lost. Crew in life rafts. We sank by our own hands." All were rescued by 2 other U-boats operating nearby. Holtring, however, committed suicide on deck. Even the most modern U-boats couldn't cope with the sky. The U-190, a Type 19C, was operating off Canada when it was spotted by a Sunderland. "We didn't see it coming. The radar was silent. The first hit set the bow battery ablaze. Screams, smoke, we just wanted to get out. But the sea wouldn't allow it," wrote its engineer, one of only 6 rescued. Submarine warfare, which had begun as an invisible dance of shadows and torpedoes, became a sustained martyrdom. The sky, which they had previously ignored, became the main battlefield. Where they once hunted, they now fled. Where they once accumulated tonnage, they now counted casualties. The sea no longer offered protection, and the hum of a distant engine in the night meant no hope, only death from above. The convoy battles in the Arctic. The Arctic was a frontier where even steel broke. Where the sea turned black as night and the ice pounded like a living creature, German submariners were sent to patrol trade routes covered by escorts, storms, and death. It was a different war, slower, colder, quieter. It was the inglorious war, the white hell where men fought not only against enemies but against nature itself. Since the Allies began sending supplies to the Soviet Union via Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, the German High Command assigned submarine groups to intercept them. The Norwegian Sea, the Barents Sea, and the area between Bear Island and North Cape became a permanent battlefield. But fighting there wasn't like in the Central Atlantic or on the American routes. It was like going to the end of the world. Aboard the U-boats assigned to that area, everything froze. The bunks, the locks, the instruments. Ice accumulated inside and out on the torpedo tubes. The sights fogged up in seconds. The men slept with their boots on and blankets stiff with frost. The humid air inside condensed on every metal surface, forming drops that constantly dripped down the bulkheads. "It felt like the ship was crying," wrote a radio operator on U-636. While cruising on the surface, snow accumulated on the sail, on the turret, and in the external walkways. The polar breeze cracked lips and burned skin. Lookouts had to be replaced every 15 minutes. Some suffered frostbite just from holding binoculars. One sailor came down with his eyebrows covered in ice and blood. He didn't complain. He just stared. He never spoke clearly again, the commander of U-307 noted in his war diary. Breaking the ice was a daily task, with axes, with hammers, with bare hands. It was necessary to clear the hatches, the torpedo tubes, the periscope. If a valve didn't open because of a crust of ice, the submarine could become trapped and unable to submerge. We spent a whole hour scraping ice off the lid of the schnorkel. The sea moved like a sleeping giant. Every minute we knew they could see us, recounted a petty officer on U-362. Submersion was hardly a relief. Temperatures inside the hull remained low and humidity permeated everything. Sleep was difficult. Sleep was brief, interrupted by alarms or the shuddering of the engine. Rations froze. Bread hardened to rock hard. Butter was cut with a knife, and coffee cooled before it reached our mouths. We ate more with our hands than with our mouths, and we spoke little. The cold made you silent, wrote a cook on U-278. The sky was a perpetual layer of lead. For weeks on end, the sun didn't rise. The polar night dominated the men's rhythm of life. The darkness, interrupted only by a greenish emergency light or a convoy flare, lulled many into a state of lethargy and paranoia. Some talked in their sleep, others prayed without faith. There was a comrade who looked at a photo of his wife all the time. One day he tore it up without saying anything, recalled a young sailor from U-739. Combat was rare but deadly. Torpedoes often missed when they hit icebound vessels. The magnetic detonation mechanism failed. In other cases, after the attack, the submarine was trapped under ice sheets. On a mission off Murmansk, U-387 fired 2 torpedoes at a convoy and was immediately pursued by 3 British destroyers. We were between ice and a rocky bottom. We were moving at 3 knots. We heard the sonars like knives in our ears, the diving officer recounted. Depth charges not only affected the hull, but also morale. Each explosion was like a verdict. Water rushed in through the smallest valves, the lamps flickered, and one was convinced that everything had arrived, wrote the lieutenant of U-601, later sunk in the Barents Sea. The sailors who survived these patrols returned aged, not from time, but from what they had experienced. They had lost comrades, fingernails, bits of sanity. At the bases in Narvik, Hammerfest, or Tromsø, no one celebrated their returns. They received a hot drink, a blanket, and were sent to the hospital or directly to the dock to prepare for another sortie. The testimonies agree that the greatest enemy was not the human enemy, but the sea. The ice was cruel, the water thicker, denser. The hull was often covered with plaque that interfered with the systems. The engines suffered from freezing. The diesel fuel thickened. In some cases, the oxygen tubes broke from the cold. There were patrols in which not a single torpedo was fired. It was all sailing, waiting, and cold. On one occasion, the U-472 was stranded among shifting pack ice for 2 days. We couldn't move. The creaking noise was constant. It seemed like something alive was surrounding us, one sailor wrote in his logbook. Upon surfacing, they were located by a British Catalina. 3 bombs hit them. The submarine broke in 2. Only 1 sailor survived, rescued by a Russian ship. Even the retreats were an odyssey. The return west meant crossing patrolled corridors, minefields, and signal-deprived areas. Many submarines returning from Arctic patrols disappeared without a trace. They sank due to accumulated damage, internal explosions, or simply material fatigue. In the BDU reports, Arctic missions rarely featured prominently. They didn't offer large figures on tonnage sunk. But among the submariners, it was common knowledge. Patrolling in the north was a punishment, a rite of passage into hopelessness. We weren't hunters there. We were shadows. No one sang. No one laughed. We were just surviving, wrote a veteran of U-354, one of the few units to return 3 times from the White Hell. For them, the war wasn't a series of glorious attacks. It was about enduring the ice, the silence, the fear, and hoping that at least once more the hull would hold. The last grey wolves disappeared. In 1944, German submarine warfare was no longer a hunt, it was a curse. The hunter's time had slipped away in the depths of the Atlantic, and now each patrol was a march into the unknown, a slow farewell. The submariners knew this. They saw it in the dull faces of new recruits, in the sinking lists received by radio, in the delays in handovers. They felt it in the thick air of the torpedo room, in the fading murmurs of late-night chatter. War was no longer daring. It was endurance. The year began with overwhelming evidence that Allied air superiority had reached its fullest extent. Every sortie meant crossing a corridor of constant surveillance where British and American aircraft swept from Iceland to the French coast at a pace unthinkable years before. Equipped with centimeter radar, Lee searchlights, anti-submarine bombs, and tactical coordination with convoys, the patrol squadrons were an invisible order of events. We went out knowing there were eyes on us. We didn't know from where or when they would attack us. We just knew they were there. wrote a radio operator on U-445 sunk in August off Ireland. U-boats that managed to cross the initial patrol line found a different ocean from the one of the happy years. The Atlantic was a desert without targets, where convoys sailed well protected and the BDU radio offered nothing but empty coordinates. Many U-boats wandered for weeks without detecting a single merchant vessel. Others were forced to abort the mission before reaching the designated area, pursued from the first day by destroyers or armed Catalinas. "We couldn't attack. We couldn't observe. We could barely breathe," wrote the commander of U-988 shortly before his final sortie. Technicians reported increasing failures, material wear, intensive use, a shortage of spare parts, and constant operational pressure were taking their toll. Batteries were less efficient, periscopes leaked water, and diesel engines ran on poor quality fuel. In several cases, missions were cut short by fires, acid leaks, or air system failures. An engineer officer on U-741 described his final sortie as an act of faith and despair. Every sound could be a bomb, every spark could be the end. Morale was slowly crumbling. Some crew members spoke little, others didn't sleep. There were superstitions, silent rituals before each dive. No one touched the hatch before departure without closing their eyes. The letters grew sadder and shorter. "My mother used to say I wrote like a dead man," confessed a young gunner on the U-390. Death was no longer a distant rumor, it was the norm. Sometimes it appeared in the form of an underwater shadow. Other times it appeared in the form of an order: emergency dive. The new generations of submariners were increasingly younger and less well-trained. The most experienced officers had either died or been sent away for training. On board, the difference was palpable. I had a helmsman who couldn't swim. Another couldn't read a 24-hour clock. "They were good guys, but they didn't know what they were doing," said an officer on U-981. At times, fear paralyzed them. At other times, it led them to make mistakes. One day, a poorly closed valve caused water to leak while they were charging the batteries. The result was an electrical fire that left the submarine adrift. 3 men died of suffocation. The BDU attempted to renew the initiative with new models, such as the Type 21, and with tactics like improved wolf packs with air support. But production delays and Allied technological superiority rendered these efforts belated gestures. The introduction of the schnorkel allowed U-boats to navigate submerged for longer periods, but also created new problems: extreme fatigue, permanent condensation, respiratory dysfunction, and nervous breakdowns. The air was acidic, humid, thick. Sometimes we saw sparks in the dark, and we didn't know if they were real, confessed a sonar operator on U-480. The attacks were no longer organized offensives. They were desperate ambushes with little coordination. Sometimes torpedoes were fired at shadows. Other times, everything was sacrificed to close in on a convoy. In March, U-845 managed to penetrate a formation and sank 2 freighters. It was located within minutes by 4 Canadian frigates. They destroyed it, leaving no survivors. There was no time to send a final message. Returning to port offered no relief. The bases in France were the target of constant bombing: Lorient, Brest, La Rochelle, Saint-Nazaire. Each one lived amidst alarms, fires, and craters. The crews returned to an empty dock, its surface cracked by explosions, its barracks destroyed, its comrades dead. On one occasion, upon returning to Bordeaux, a crew discovered that their hut had been hit the day before. "Half of my men had no bed, the other half had no one to tell what we had experienced," wrote one flotilla commander. Some began to see the war as an absurd punishment. Others convinced themselves that all was lost. In letters, commanders asked to be reassigned. Sailors spoke of death as a relief. "We don't want medals, we want to live another day," wrote one. The myth of the submariner as a silent hero began to crumble. They were no longer wolves, they were ghosts. In 1944, going out on patrol was almost a sure thing. Of every 10 submarines that set sail, only 4 returned. And those that did so without strength, without faith, without a future. Life on board was no longer camaraderie, nor technique, nor adventure. It was rot, dampness, anxiety, insomnia, an existence without time or hope, where only the creaking of the hull and the hum of the sonar kept the soul clinging to something. For the German submariners of 1944, the war had ceased to be a military campaign. It was a condemnation experienced in darkness, in silence, under tons of pressure. A journey toward nothingness. A slow shipwreck of the spirit. And yet, many kept coming out, because no one else could, because it was their duty, because they didn't know how to do anything else. The submarines of the future that arrived too late. In the final days of the war, when defeat was already inevitable, the German war machine continued producing submarines as if there was still hope. It was an act of denial, a mechanical impulse that didn't correspond to reality. The factories remained active. Workers continued assembling parts. Engineers continued adjusting plans. While Berlin was relentlessly bombed, the Third Reich poured its remaining resources into the frantic production of the weapon that had been both its pride and its bane, the U-boat. They were built faster than ever. In the shipyards of Hamburg, Danzig and Bremen, the hulls were assembled in sections, transported by rail, welded together by shifts of exhausted workers and launched without ceremony. Quality had declined, but numbers continued to grow. By the end of 1944, a new U-boat was completed every day and a half. However, many never sailed. Some were captured in dock, others sunk by the Germans themselves before they fell into enemy hands. Dozens remained half-finished, lined up like steel ghosts, stranded in dry docks that no longer made sense. Amidst this industrial madness, Dönitz's latest technological venture emerged, the Type 21. It was a revolutionary design, the first truly ocean-going submarine that could operate submerged for weeks with high-capacity batteries, silent propulsion, superior underwater speed, and an unprecedentedly hydrodynamic hull. It featured automation, separate observation and attack periscopes, and rapid-fire torpedoes from hydraulically reloadable tubes. It was, on paper, the weapon that could have reversed the course of the war had it arrived sooner, but it arrived too late. Of the more than 120 Type 21s completed, barely a dozen ever sailed in combat conditions. Their crews were inexperienced, their systems untested, and their sorties sporadic. U-2-511 unter dem Befehl von Kapitänleutnant Schnee set sail am 30. April 1945, demselben Tag Hitler sich selbst in seinem Bunker erschoss. During its patrol, it detected an Allied convoy, took up attack position undetected, but did not fire. It received the order to cease hostilities. It turned around and returned to port. It was a silent demonstration of the weapon that was never used. Other Type 21s were sunk in the Norwegian fjords by their own crews. The steel still smelled of fresh paint. The valves had never been used. They were empty coffins, built for a war that no longer existed. One by one they disappeared beneath the water with controlled explosions. There were no tears. There were no ceremonies. Just a dull crack and a swirl of bubbles while white flags began to wave on the surface. The Allies rushed to study these new submarines. The Americans, British and Soviets divided up the surviving units. The Type 21 became the basis for Cold War naval developments. But for the men who built them, who inhabited them, who sank them before use, they were not prototypes of the future. They were graves without dead, monuments to failure, death of the U-boat force. The end came like an icy whisper, not with a clear order or a formal surrender, but with the growing sense that everything was crumbling around them. The German submariners still on patrol in April and May 1945 navigated without reliable maps, without secure stations, without precise objectives. The bases in France no longer existed. Those in the Baltic Sea were collapsing. The radios spoke of an unstoppable Soviet offensive, of cities razed to the ground, of defense lines that lasted for hours. The orders coming from the OKM were ambiguous, desperate. Patrol, attack, avoid capture. And at the same time, prepare to sink one's own ship if necessary, like a death sentence written in naval code. Many commanders knew they were no longer fighting for victory, but to avoid falling alive into enemy hands. On some submarines, the article ordering the ship's destruction before surrendering was read in a low voice. Discussions raged about what to do with the crew. Some spoke of one last charge, of finding a convoy and sinking one more ship before the end. Others thought about surviving, crossing the Atlantic, hiding, and some simply waited, underwater in silence, not knowing whether they would emerge to find a world still at war or one that had already forgotten them. Life in those final days was a mixture of resignation and madness. Supplies were scarce. The batteries were cared for as if they were liquid life. The food was rotten, and the humidity made the men sick. The engines had faults that no one could repair. There were no more reliefs, no rest, only a slow, blind trudge, full of ghosts. We spent hours without speaking. We only listened to the sonar. The world out there was ending, and we were stuck in a steel tomb without knowing when to get out, wrote a radio operator on U-2324. Some U-boats, like U-977 and U-530, embarked on absurd voyages, escaping toward South America in the hope of avoiding capture. These were endless days of radio silence, periscope navigation, and total uncertainty. U-530 arrived in Mar del Plata in July 1945, weeks after the surrender. The sailors emerged thin, with burned skin, without insignia. No one understood why they continued sailing, not even them. Others didn't even have that option. U-3523, a modern Type 21 submarine, was sunk by a British plane on May 6, 1945. Everyone died. They never saw combat. They never received the ceasefire message. In the final hours of the war, death no longer obeyed logic. It attacked out of routine, out of reflex. At the northern bases in Norway, Denmark, and the Baltic, the last U-boats were sunk by their own crews. In Kiel, dozens of submarines were sabotaged, their valves opened, their internal systems destroyed so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands. The sailors emerged with tears in their eyes, knowing they would never sail again. Some threw themselves into the water rather than surrender their boat. Others committed suicide inside, as if the U-boat were an inseparable part of their bodies. At the Wilhelmshaven base, the submariners watched the British troops approach without resistance. Their uniforms were torn, their eyes hollow. We stood there, unarmed, watching the enemy flag being raised over our base. No one said anything. There was a strange dignity in that silence, wrote a young commander of U-3030. The final hours also brought impossible decisions. In some cases, officers decided to scuttle the boats with the torpedoes still loaded. Others ordered the U-boats to be abandoned at sea after disabling vital systems. We were in the middle of the North Sea. We opened the hatches, climbed onto the deck and jumped into the water. The submarine sank like a stone. We waited for hours until a British destroyer rescued us. They didn't fire at us. They just watched us. I didn't know if I was alive or dead, recounted an officer on watch aboard U-2501. Formal surrenders came later in waves. On May 4, 1945, all U-boats were ordered to cease hostilities and head for Allied ports. Some surrendered on the high seas, raising black flags. Others never responded. Some were sunk by mistake even after the war's end. For those who survived, the post-war period brought no relief. They were interned in camps, interrogated, humiliated. Their ships were dismantled, displayed, studied. Their stories for decades were buried under the collective guilt of the defeated Reich. But for them, those who breathed filtered air, those who slept next to torpedoes and urine, those who watched their comrades die without burial, the end had come long before, sometime in 1943 or 1944, when they stopped believing, when they understood that the sea would no longer protect them. The final days of the war for the submariners weren't an epilogue. They were a condemnation, a silent march into darkness. Some disappeared without a trace. Others were buried in mass graves, and the few who managed to return could never tell the full story because there were no words to explain what it felt like to be swallowed up by the war and to return alone with the sound of the sonar still in your bones.